I'm going to show you how to make a table like this or something similar if you want to use some different colors. But the most important thing is you follow the techniques I show in this video to get the texture and that pattern of as realistic of marble as possible. But before we do that, let me show you what the table looked like beforehand. My little sister's been bothering me about this beat up, makeup, vanity table thing for months now, and the only real way to deal with ladies like these is to give in and do what they want. So after a couple of samples, we've got the perfect color combo for her, which is the pearl, champagne, and rose gold. So my basic plan for the entire project is I'm going to take all of the horizontal surfaces, this surface, the inside, and also the faces of these shelves, and I'm going to do those with metallic epoxy. I'm going to have to put a primer anyways, so I'm just going to prime the entire surface just to freshen it up, even the places that are not going to be getting any type of metallic system. So the first and obvious order of business is removing any of this gunk, just anything that basically has any type of adhesive underneath it. So this tape has to go, and I'm not going to show you all of the pimple stickers that she left all over the thing because I don't want this video to get removed off of YouTube, but it was gross. And you're probably going to come across a sticker like this. You do need to remove it, but be sure to take a picture of it because you're going to need the information on the sticker at the end. And then comes the boring part of disassembling everything. And again, you don't have to have this clean. All you need to do is make sure any of that gunk or adhesive is removed because the next part we're going to do is sanding. We're doing this for a couple of things. Number one is to address this atrocious water damage that's on top of some of the horizontal surfaces. I'm hitting it with about 100 grit. It's pretty abrasive, but it's going to get through any of those raised water damage bumps pretty quickly. And I need to make sure that the surface is completely smooth, level, and flush. And it is only those horizontal areas I'm going to be applying epoxy to, but the vertical surfaces aren't going to get the metallic epoxy treatment, but I'm sanding them anyways with a much less aggressive grit, about 220. The reason is I'm going to prime them anyways, and I want the primer to have some nice micro scratches to grab onto to make sure it doesn't flake off. And then all of those areas which are going to be treated with metallic epoxy get hit with a routing bit. This rounds out the edge and lets the epoxy flow over the edge. If that edge is sharp, anything close to a 90-degree angle, it's not going to be able to roll off the edge and create a seamless transition between top and vertical layers of that board. This is a pretty important step, and if you don't have a routing bit, you could just manually hand sand it, but it's definitely a lot easier to use a routing bit to make sure everything is consistently rounded across the entire surface. But I've definitely done it by hand before. You can do it, just be slow and methodical about it. And another thing we have to address is that most of these tables are made out of particle board, and that stuff is notorious for having these atrocious voids inside of it, which are going to be a problem. I'm going to patch those up with something called GEP. That's the epoxy paste we have. It reminds me a little bit of Bondo, but it's creamier and it has a much longer work time, so I'm not sitting here working in tiny batches and trying to manage the timing perfectly. I mixed up how much I need for the entire job, and I'm just methodically making sure everything is nice and smooth. If you don't do this step, what's going to happen is the epoxy will cover those voids, but they're still going to be telegraphing through to the other side. It looks really ugly. And like any of these projects, the best way to get the perfect finish at the end is to do the right prep work in the beginning. And once all of the prep work is done, we can start hitting it with that water-based epoxy primer. The primer does a couple of things. The first thing being it'll cover up the original color of that particle board, just so you don't see that ugly particle board color kind of ghosting through that metallic epoxy coat. The table I'm doing is mostly white, so I'm going to be using a white primer, and that logic goes both ways. So if you're going to be doing a black table, you would do a black primer. If you're doing something in between, you would use a gray primer, etc. And the next extremely important thing the primer does is it closes the pores of the wood, right? The wood is an extremely porous material. It'll suck up that material pretty good. And if you're not using a primer, what you're risking is the metallic epoxy either creating a lot of bubbles as gas is escaping out of the wood, or you're just going to get ugly looking dry spots on that metallic epoxy coating where it looks like the wood absorbed it over here, it didn't absorb it over there. That project basically has to be completely redone. Primer stops those problems by closing up the pores in that wood. And again, I'm hitting both sides of every single piece right here, even though all of them aren't going to be getting a metallic epoxy coating. It'll give this thing a nice consistent color throughout the entire piece. And now at this point, I've waited for the epoxy to semi-cure. What that means is when I touch it, it's still tacky. It almost feels like the underside of a piece of tape. It It's sticking to my finger, it's making this weird Velcro sound, but it's solid enough for you to start working on it. Now, because it's tacky, I don't have to sand. It's going to have a bond to the actual metallic epoxy system because of that tack. But if it was completely tack-free, the next step you would have to do is sand this with 220 grit so that instead of a chemical bond, you would get a mechanical bond between the primer and the metallic epoxy. But before addressing that metallic epoxy, I have to address a couple of holes in my plan. These holes. I don't want the metallic epoxy flowing inside of these holes. I'm definitely going to need them for further reassembly afterwards. And the easiest way that I could come up with to prevent the epoxy from getting into those holes is to use the actual dowels that go into those holes. So to make sure the epoxy doesn't stick to the dowels either, I'm going to cover them up with some Scotch tape, and that's going to be plenty enough for us to be able to remove them a little bit later. On the underside, I have a similar issue, but I'm not going to be using dowels because those are semicircles. I'm just going to pack that in with clay, and I'll show you how I deal with that after it cures. And then I'm going to go ahead and put all my wood boards on top of these painting pyramids. What that does is it elevates those boards above the floor. It allows the epoxy to drip off of the surface instead of pooling around it on the bottom, which is going to be a huge mess and much harder to work with. And the next step is I'm going to be creating a wall around our boards with some blue painter's tape. And that's just going to keep the epoxy contained on that surface for long enough for us to have the design that I originally anticipated without too much of it flowing off of the table and creating a really blurry mess. You could do this without those blue walls, but your result is going to look far different from what I've got. And now that everything is prepped up, it's time to start mixing up the GE100 epoxy at a 2 parts A to 1 part B ratio. The reason I'm using specifically this epoxy is because it is UV resistant. Now the table isn't going to be getting that much direct sunlight, but it's still really important to use something like this, a non-yellowing epoxy, because the table is going to be white, and white epoxy is notorious for turning yellow. This GE100 is going to do a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to colors like these as opposed to other types of epoxy. Once all that GE100 is mixed up, I'll start adding the metallic pigments. The first one is the pearl. This is going to be our white base. That's the majority of the epoxy I'm doing. And notice how I'm not doing this in a standard epoxy mixing method. Instead of pouring part A, part B for each separate color, I'm just mixing everything up inside of one large bucket, spreading that catalyzed product out into different buckets and quickly mixing up that metallic pigment. This is a method I would only recommend if you're really comfortable working with these products, because you do have to work pretty quickly. You don't want to keep the epoxy inside of the bucket. You want to mix everything up really quickly, get it out of there as soon as possible, and mix it long enough also to make sure that you don't have any dry or unmixed clumps of metallic pigment in there. I've done this a lot of times. If you're a beginner to this, mix up part A and part B separately for each color that you're doing so you have a lot more working time. And the second color I'm adding is the champagne, and I'm not doing a lot of it. Compared to the amount of pearl that I have, the amount of champagne and the other secondary color I'll be using is about 5%, and I'm still not going to use all of that. When it comes to those white bases, they get really heavily influenced by darker colors, and you'd be really surprised just how little pigment it takes for a white to stop being a white and turn into something else. And this would be the opposite vice versa, right? If your base was black, you would have to use a lot more of a lighter pigment in your accents because that black does a really good job of overpowering every other color. And the next color we're going to be using is the rose gold, which is going to give it those nice pinkish accents. And again, you got to make sure to mix this up pretty well to make sure all that pigment is saturated and fully dispersed, which isn't that big of a deal with the G100 because the G100 is a fairly viscous product. It's pretty watery. There are some tabletop epoxies I've used before which are an absolute nightmare. They're so thick and goopy, and the method I'm showing you right now just would not be feasible for those things. So again, make a bunch of samples. It's not only going to help you with determining the colors that you want, but it's going to familiarize you with the product you're using and help you build a better workflow on what you want to do with a finished piece. Now all that's mixed up, I'm going to go ahead and spread out that pearl epoxy, the base, all the way across the entire thing. I'm not making any patterns yet. I'm just getting the entire base saturated and completely covered with that pearl metallic epoxy. And I'm doing this with a decent amount of epoxy. I'm doing it pretty thick. I'm aiming for around 15 to 30 square feet per gallon range. Like by my experience, the thicker you do the epoxy, the more intricate you can do those patterns, the more in-depth and 3D they are. They just look nicer. It's more expensive if you do it thicker, but again, just like with anything with epoxy, you get what you pay for. And now I'm gonna start pouring out those accents. I'm doing it in these thin diagonal strips. That's the way I could more or less make it mimic natural looking marble. So I'm not doing polka dots or anything. And if you have a larger piece, you don't have to have these strips be completely straight. They could have curves and edges to them, but try to make these strips all more or less following the same direction. And then to start blending those colors out, it's pretty easy. I'm using a gloved hand with all 5 of my fingers, just spreading it across. I'm not trying to get any type of texture right now. I'm just blending those colors so that they blend together a little bit more naturally and it looks less like paint where it's one solid line over here and another solid line of color right next to it. And again, just like when you're pouring those strips, make sure your fingers are following a natural direction. Don't do any swirls. That's not a natural thing you find in any type of stone. You're going with the flow as if you're sculpting that rock into existence. Now, for the majority of our texturing, we're gonna use the popsicle stick method, where we dip a popsicle stick inside of our metallic accent color and then use that stick to draw on those accents. But we're not gonna be moving that popsicle stick carefully. Instead, we're gonna be shaking our hand as if we're being electrocuted. The reason we're doing this is because when you're trying to mimic as natural looking stone as possible, when you're making veins, you want to make them look as least deliberate as possible. It sounds counterintuitive. You want to make it look as perfect as you possibly can, but when you think way too much about where each vein is going to go, at that point you make the veins look too man-made. It doesn't look like something that was created by accident in the earth. It looks like somebody trying to mimic a natural looking texture, which is pretty easy to suss out. You've definitely noticed this phenomenon if you've ever tried to deliberately take an off-guard photo of yourself and every single time end up looking like a tryhard or a poser. If you're too deliberate with epoxy, then your table is going to look like a poser. And if you completely shut your mind off, there's no telling what type of table you're going to make. So there's definitely a fine line that you have to dance over here. Something in between not thinking and thinking really hard about where you want your veins to be. This thing is definitely an art, and like every other art, there's no other way to get good at it besides practice. Again, which is why it's always a good idea to make sample pieces. You want to give yourself the opportunity to make mistakes before you make them on the actual final project. But anyways, now you could see better what I was talking about earlier. Most of that blending I was doing with my fingers is just background noise. Most of the actual texturing is being done with that popsicle stick. Sometimes I'm using it with the accent color on there, or sometimes I'm moving that existing background color into a direction I like more. If there's too much dark spots here and too much light spots there, I'll definitely cover up those light spots with some veins to make the pattern look less empty. And keep working that texture into something that you like, keeping in mind that it's still gonna flow and still gonna move around and shift without any of your input. I definitely recommend taking a picture of the epoxy before you start texturing it, just so you see what it looked like before and after. This texturing process is a bit more gradual and harder to spot, almost like when you're growing out your hair. You don't notice it day by day, but if you see a picture of yourself months beforehand, the difference is a lot more noticeable. Here's an example. This is what it looked like before I started texturing, and here's what it looks like by the end. Before, at the end. Before, after. When you're done with that, you can go ahead and hit it with a torch to remove any type of bubbles, and we're going to leave those tape walls there for a little while. Here's a wider shot of me doing the same technique on every other panel, pouring thin strips, spreading those in natural patterns with my fingers, torching them, and leaving them be for a little while. And earlier I mentioned that you wanted to get the epoxy out of the bucket as soon as possible, and that's actually really important. This isn't just for the GU100, this is for any type of epoxy. When you mix the part A and the part B, what happens is the catalyzation of the product, and it starts going into a chemical reaction. A byproduct of that chemical reaction is it starts to heat the epoxy, and the funny thing is the heat actually helps the epoxy cure quicker. So because it's curing, it's heating, and because it's heating, it's curing, and because it's curing, it's heating. And the best way to slow that process down is spreading the epoxy as thin as you can. The heating process is almost not noticeable at the thickness we're putting this on, but it's definitely noticeable in a large mass like inside of the bucket. An epoxy could have a working time, right? Not a cure time, but a working time of an hour and a half, and an inexperienced person leaves it inside of the bucket. The chemical reaction gets amplified and it solidifies inside of that bucket within 20 minutes. And now that you can see the epoxy is more or less spread out, I'm gonna speed up the tape, and you could see that the epoxy shifts and moves, even with those tape walls created there. So that just shows you what you see right now is not gonna be what the epoxy looks like at the end of the project. It moves around and has a life of its own. And this also shows you the extreme importance of having the table you're working on be extremely level. If it's pitched even slightly to the left or right, all of that epoxy is going to be flowing in that direction, and it's not going to look good. And in this speed up time lapse, you could kind of see me running around and poking the epoxy with a stick. This is me checking whether it's time to take off those walls and let the epoxy roll down the sides on its own. Now, it's a timing game, and that specific time is going to depend on a bunch of different factors, like the temperature you have, the amount of humidity in the air. For me, it took about an hour and 10 minutes for me to see that it's time to remove those walls. And how I know is when it starts becoming goopy, no longer as thin as it used to be. This is exactly the consistency I'm looking for. So do not wait for an hour and 10 minutes. Instead, consistently check at the very corner to make sure your epoxy looks like mine does. And the reason we're doing it at the very corner is because all of that material is going to roll off the edge anyway, so it doesn't matter that I'm messing up the texture or the pattern over there. This testing dip is not something you want to do in the middle of your project. And you can see the minute I start removing that tape, it starts dripping down the edges, but it's not dripping in a uniform layer. It's doing exactly that. It's dripping. Some layers are being covered, some layers are not. And so I use a gloved hand to make sure that I get the entire surface area covered with epoxy. And that's going to make it drip and waterfall down consistently across the entire surface. The tape is removed across all of our boards. And right at that moment, as soon as we remove the tape, is a very important step to making this epoxy look more like actual marble, more natural, more realistic looking. So what you want to do is put either denatured or isopropyl alcohol inside of a spray bottle and mist the entire surface, and then also come back and spray some larger and more direct droplets of that alcohol onto the metallic epoxy. What this does is it disperses that epoxy and creates these weird looking cells across the entire thing. It's not that it creates fish eyes, but what it does is it separates one color from the other, and a lot of times it creates micro veins, it creates cells, and in general makes the epoxy look less like paint. The easiest way to describe it is it gives your epoxy a higher resolution, right? This upgrades your epoxy project from an LED to an OLED. And I did a 1 hour time lapse of the way the epoxy spreads over the edges and how it moves and transforms on its own. But that footage got corrupted, so I'm showing it to you on an iPhone footage time lapse. But you could see it's not doing all that much. It's more or less preserving the original texture, for lack of a better word, that I gave it. And that's because of that amount of time we waited with those tape walls on there. If I did it without those tape walls, the texture and pattern on this epoxy would be drastically different. And here is what it looks like the next day. I came back at about 12 hours later. The epoxy is not moving anywhere, but it's not fully solidified yet. I could do a pretty decent indentation with my fingernail. At this point, the epoxy does dent, but it's sort of elastic. It remembers its own shape, so it'll bounce back up at this point. With the G100, you don't have to worry about the indent being permanent, but we're definitely not ready for a top coat yet. What we are ready for is to address those dowels. This is actually the perfect time to take those dowels out while the epoxy is still semi-soft. I have a little bit of wiggle room to free those dowels out of there. And then at the end, I cut off the excess that raised up around the dowel. You don't have to do this. This is going to be removed by the sanding process, but I just wanted to show you how soft that epoxy is. And it's also the perfect time to remove that clay. You could go ahead and just cut it away with a box cutter. This would be a lot harder if the epoxy was fully solidified and turned to a hard plastic. So right now is the perfect time while it's still flexible and easy to cut. And one of these sheets was made out of a very thin MDF, so I couldn't really elevate it because it would warp too much and it was way too thin to put up any walls around it. So it has a lot of that epoxy spilled over all over the edges. Again, this is the perfect time to address it right now while it's still flexible. Cut it all away before the epoxy sets up too much. So I waited another 6 or so hours for the epoxy to be good enough to flip upside down. It's cured, it's not going to get dented, and we could finally address these epoxy drips on the bottom. All I'm doing is sanding them away with about 220 grit sandpaper, and I'm being extra careful not to sand off any of that primer on the bottom because I still want the bottom to look good. If you do end up sanding away any on the bottom, you'll have to end up putting another layer of primer, and if any of that primer gets on the metallic epoxy, you could wipe that away with some isopropyl alcohol. And you can see what I was talking about. When you raise the boards up, it's a lot easier because all you have to deal with is those drips around the edges. But on that thin MDF sheet that wasn't raised, the entire bottom is basically covered with that epoxy, and I have to do a lot more aggressive sanding. It's a lot more work than it should be. Now, once you're done sanding all of the bottoms, you can now proceed onto sanding the top. And we're also doing some light sanding. Again, 220 grit sandpaper. The reason we're doing this is so that the sealer we're putting on next is going to have a mechanical bond onto the metallic epoxy. Again, the sandpaper does not have to be a heavy grit. You're not trying to create giant deep grooves. Tiny little micro scratches are perfectly good enough. A 220 grit is all that I really ever do. And obviously, it's not just the top that has to be sanded, but those vertical edges also. This is where you have to be pretty careful. You could see I made a mistake. I was a little bit too aggressive in my sanding, and I sanded basically through not only the metallic pigment, but also through the primer, and you could see that ugly MDF poking its head out. Even if the primer was still there, it would still look weird. It would look like a white spot across the entire textured pattern. So on the other side, I was definitely a lot more careful. I was hand sanding it very carefully with 220 grit sandpaper, and I was barely touching it. And once everything is fully sanded, I can wipe everything down with that isopropyl alcohol. It'll get rid of all that dust, which could get in the way of the sealing process. And the best way to clean this stuff is isopropyl alcohol. It'll wipe everything better than water, and it'll dry faster than water too. And once everything is cleaned up, now it's time for the final step of the epoxy application process, which is the sealer. The sealer I'm using is a solvent-based polyurethane sealer, which is a food-grade sealer. I don't think she's going to be eating on top of this vanity table, but it's still a table. That's still the type of sealer I would recommend applying on any of these type of surfaces, whether it be a countertop or any type of table. Now, the reason you would use a sealer, or a lot of times it's called a top coat, is because you want to protect the epoxy from scratches, right? Epoxy is notoriously scratchable. It has almost zero scratch resistance, and the top coat's going to allow you to have a table that's going to last for a lot longer and look brand new for a lot longer. Now, a lot of times on epoxy and other non-porous surfaces like this, all you need is one coat of the sealer, but if you ever miss a spot or you don't like the way that it looks, you could always add a second coat. And what's really important to make sure you don't have to add a second coat is back rolling the sealer. That means if you're going north-south, then switch over to east-west, east-west. That lowers the chances of you missing a spot, one, and two, it basically spreads out the epoxy, making sure that you get an even coverage, that there's not too much here, too little there. Now, there is something I do want to address about these top coats. Even though I am using a gloss top coat right now, the epoxy is never going to be as glossy as before it was sealed. Before the epoxy is sealed, it has basically a glass-like finish. Here's an example. On one side, there's the epoxy before it was sealed, then in the middle, this is where it was sanded, and then on the other end, that's where I put the gloss top coat, and you can see it has almost like an orange peel type of texture. This is basically inevitable with any type of top coat, and there's nothing you can do about it. If that really is a deal breaker for you, you could leave it this glossy glass finish, and then you just wait a couple of months until it gets completely scratched up, and then you can go ahead and sand it and put a top coat on, and that's a perfectly viable option. But let's go back to when I told you to take a picture of that sticker, because you're going to need it later. On that sticker, you're probably going to find a model number, and you're going to find an instruction manual on how you can actually put this thing back together. And trust me, you're probably going to need it. I mean, I definitely tried to do it without the instruction manual like any self-respecting man would, but eventually I had to give in and start following the orders of a small piece of paper. It's a tale as old as time. I am rambling again. Here is what the thing looks like when it's fully assembled.
No.
What no?
Wait. 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 Wait, that's so pretty. You even put my little butt up. I love.
The amount of sample pieces I had to do to get the specific colors and the specific dosages that she wanted was pretty ridiculous, but I do want to know what type of colors you would have used had you been doing something similar for yourself. And on a finishing note, the reason why YouTubers constantly ask you and berate you to leave a like, to comment, is that convinces the YouTube algorithm to show other people this content. So if you found any of this content interesting, I would really appreciate it if you liked and commented, because that would help me out and the channel out more than you can imagine. Thank Thank you guys so much for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.
This is so cute. I love it. This is so cute.
You're welcome.
You annoyed me to the point I had to do it.
It's so pretty.
I'm glad you like it.